Hey y'all! Well, it's time for some subjective listening reviews of a bunch of different tube amplifiers. And I think it's important to highlight that we are comparing the R300 to other single-ended tube amplifiers. And we're not listening to this in isolation or listening to this after we've been listening to solid state gear, because that will definitely taint the listening impression. So let's go over the technical aspects of the listening test. And it's important that it's repeatable and that you really know what you're listening to. And I found something that I feel really covers kind of the gamut of the music that I'm going to be listening to and has the right kind of details in it to really pick out and highlight strengths and weaknesses in different amplifiers and tubes, tube rolling, all that kind of stuff. So first, the sources. The first test is done with a Yamaha CD deck, a S300, and we listened to Earl Klug's Whispers and Promises. We have it on CD. And the track we listened to is Master of Suspense. And we listened to about the first minute of the track. It's important that you don't listen to too long of a section so that you forget like the details of the various sections. And sometimes we'll listen to like the first 30 seconds 2 or 3 times to really get an impression. And the thing about this track that I like is at the very start of it, there's this whoosh. And it's got a real shimmery kind of sound to it that a lot of amplifiers will just smear into one sound. And a good amplifier, you can hear the dust falling off the swoosh, if you know what I'm saying. It's got a real shimmery kind of sound to it. And like I said, if an amplifier is prone to smearing, it just smears it into like one sound. It also goes from one channel to the other, so you can really hear like the sound stage that the amp has. And if it's got a wider sound stage, you can hear it moving further in front of you. And if it doesn't have a good sound stage, you can hear it just kind of go in a little short swoosh across the front of you in the listening experience. So right after that, there's a really hollow drum hit that you can hear. If the amp's a good one, you can hear the decay as it falls away from you, and it sounds like it's really going deep away. And that kind of really plays into like the whole depth of the sound stage. If the amplifier doesn't have a very deep sound stage, it will just kind of go boom and then it's over. But a good amp really pulls that decay out, and it sounds like it's just going into the next room. Then after that, it's got some thumpy bass hits that really tax the bass of the amplifier. And then after that, there's some decent bass with some trebly stuff above it. There's some violin stuff that will get smeared into nastiness if the amplifier's, again, smearing details. And then you can really tell how the mid-range is doing if it just gets muddled into the bass or if it's like in front of the bass. And so it's a really good track to me to listen to, amplifiers and listen to over and over and really highlight the strengths and weaknesses of amplifiers. So then the second one is on vinyl. Got a Techniques turntable with a OC9 MXL moving coil cartridge. We're using an R. Clayton step-up transformer with some Cinemag step-up transformers. We're running the, I have to always look at this, the 1:12 ratio. step up into the EAR 834 clone preamp that then goes into the main amp, of course. And really good sounding turntable, preserves a lot of detail. And we listen to Laid Black Marcus Miller 45 RPM LP. This is like the bass test. This has got some insane bass tracks in it. And we listened to the very first one, which is Trip Trap. It's got, like I said, just the bass is insane. And it really saturates the output transformers. And then some delicate high notes get overlaid on top of this super heavy bass track. And so it's going to show if the output transformers can actually deal with that sort of music. Because it's one of the things tube amps struggle with, is really making decent power at the very low frequency levels and still be able to play high notes and have some shimmering highs on top of the transformer getting oversaturated or heavily saturated by these bass notes. So first of all, we're going to do like this tier of amplifiers. And this is one of my go-to amps. It's a EL34 6SQ7. It's got 15 watt EdCore output transformers, which are about $85 a piece. You know, some pretty budget iron. Got some JJ EL34 tubes, which are about $20 a piece tubes. And then these are some new old stock JAN Sylvania 6SQ7 tubes, which again, maybe 20 bucks a piece on the market. And it's got a nice choke. It's got some heavy duty 2 stages of filtration in the power supply. Really clean sounding amp. And this isn't the best sounding amp I have, but this is a good baseline. For the super budget end, we have this little Spud amp, which is 6LU8 Compactron tube. These are like color TV sweep tubes that sound really nice. Again, we got these 15 watt EdCore output transformers. Both of these are wired in ultralinear, and both these amps have plate to plate local shade feedback loops, which along with the ultralinear is probably why they sound so similar. So let's get down to what do these sound like. And surprisingly to me, this amp and the R300 sound very similar. And that is not saying anything disparaging about the R300, because this is a really good sounding amp. Now, we'll say on the first test with the Earl Klugh song that this amp and this amp had a little deeper soundstage. I felt like the first drum hit just had a more hollow sound to it. And of the 3 amps, this one reproduced that shimmer across the stage sound much cleaner with more sparkle. This, to me, smeared it a little bit. Got into the rest of the song, and these sound really similar. This was able to deal with the snare drums fine. Again, both these two sounded very similar. And just so you're aware of kind of price points of stuff we're talking about here, $600 worth of parts plus labor. This would probably equate to about a $1,200 retail amp, would be my guess. This is about $400 worth of parts and probably be about $800, $900, something like that. So this again is a $1,500 amp with, expensive tubes to roll. So back to the subjective listening. First track, really it was really close. I mean, it was just very, very slight differences between the 3 amps. Well, now when we got into the Marcus Miller track, where we had the really heavy bass playing, these two walk away with the show. This one, while it sounds good, it does struggle to really pump out the bass like these 2 amps do. And Again, not sure why. Could be just this tube type doesn't have a lot of really good bass response. It's been so long I can't remember what the audio analyzer suite showed, but I think it did show some pretty significant roll off, down there at 60 to 20 hertz kind of range, where that's where my speakers pretty much roll off to, is about 40 hertz. So, we're not talking about this elephant ear hearing notes. We're talking about the probably 40 to 100 hertz range is what we're measuring or hearing in that music. And so these two definitely started walking away from this amp. So let's go back to these two. And these two definitely, again, have really good bass response. The mids sound nice. Got some decent sparkle on the top end. But where they started struggling was when we had some really heavy bass notes playing, and then some upper frequency stuff would come into the mix. I feel like the transformers were getting oversaturated. And again, these are pretty small output transformers in this amp. They're 15 watts, and you can see size-wise, they're not giant by any means. I've got no idea what's under these covers. There's no way to know. They're potted with epoxy and aggregate in there. You'd have to cut them open, destroy them to see what size iron's inside there. But could be wrong. There could be something else going on. It could be something with the power supply struggling, and that makes it where it's difficult to do these low bass notes and still having the high notes clean. We still got work to do on this amp, so I'm not sure. But that's where this threesome played out. Was I would give these two either or. They both sounded good. And again, it's not bashing this amp, because this is a really good sounding amp. But I would say these two are equal, and this one needs a powered sub to keep up with these on the second track we played. On the first track, I think it held its own. So let's compare it to the other two amps in this shootout. Okay, now we're back with this trio of amps, and let's introduce these two on the outside. This is my DIY2.2 amp, and these are the tubes that I'm running in it. Is some 300B-Zs, some tall model Sylvanias, got a Mullard 5AR4, got 25 watt 5K Edcore output transformers, which are a little high impedance for a 300B amp, but they were what I had, so that's what I built the amp with. This amp's got a super stout power supply. It's got a 10 Henry choke, and then it's got two 1.5 Henry chokes and a split rail design with separate caps for each channel. Really well thought out and probably over-engineered power supply. And then on this end, we have my 47 globe tube amp. These are directly heated pentodes, and these are indirectly heated triode driver tubes with a 80 rectifier. Again, these are 1920s probably globe tubes, RCA, with Hashimoto output transformers, which are really nice, with another super clean power supply. Got a motor run cap for the first cap of the power supply, and another really nice sounding amp. So, how do these three compare? On the first track, this amp, to me, sounds the best. It's got the cleanest top end. It's got just beautiful sparkle and soundstage when it does the little, you can just hear the dust sprinkling on the floor behind it. When it hits that first drum hit, it's so hollow it feels like it just goes into another room. It's so deep. Just really nice sounding amplifier. I've listened to this versus this before, but I never really critically sat down and compared them back to back, and I was really surprised what I was hearing out of this amp. And I think it's mostly these really nice Hashimoto output transformers is what I'm hearing. So, number 1, number 2, number 3 on the first track. You could definitely hear that this amp was smearing some of the mid-range in a way that these two amps don't. And the other trio, they all sounded very similar in the detail in the mid-range, but I was hearing nuances in the mid-frequencies with these two amps that I just wasn't getting out of this one. Now again, I haven't tube rolled this thing, so you guys don't hate on me, and I needed to compare it the way it comes out of the box to like my other favorite amps. And so in the future, with some mods and tube rolling, this thing may really wake up. Don't know. We'll definitely cover that in the future, but we're comparing out of the box to other amplifiers that I know sound good. So, mid-range detail was missing. The sparkle just wasn't as twinkly sounding, and it definitely didn't have as deep a sound stage as these two amps have. So then we go to the Marcus Miller, where the super bass man, and listen to the bass with the highs on top of the heavy bass. And this amp has more bass, stronger bass than this amp does. So even with these really nice output transformers, we are talking about almost 100-year-old tubes in this thing. It definitely beats this amp out as far as pure bass. But the high note getting played on top of the bass, this one still has an advantage, but I can't really give it the win because it doesn't have the bass that it's fighting against to play that higher note. And so I'll give the R300 the win on a bass heavy music over the Globe Tube amp. But on this amp versus this one, on the second track with the really heavy bass, this one preserves the detail in the mid-range even with the bass rolling. And again, I think it has to do with these bigger output transformers can just handle the bass and still be able to play the mid-range and the upper mid-range. Again, I don't know what's inside these boxes, and I'd have to see pictures of what's inside them before they pot them. Only the manufacturer knows what's inside these cans, and without sacrificing the amp and cut the cans open, I have no idea. And it could be that when we get to tube rolling and put some nicer tubes in this and get the power supply stiffened up, that issue will resolve itself. But out of the box, DIY300B actually sounds the best out of this whole group of amplifiers overall with both tracks. And again, this is just my subjective listening. And people were trashing me in the other comments about, okay, you're beating up on an amplifier you've never listened to. I mean, I listened to these things, but I didn't sit down and critically listen to them. And now I have. And after listening and seeing what I saw on the audio analyzer suite, I feel like the smearing that I'm hearing in the mid-range is probably because of the noise that we were also seeing is covering that up and masking the details in the mid-range. And I'm hoping that that noise is coming from a insufficiently filtered power supply, and once we get that sorted out and get the noise floor down, that those details are going to come up out of the floor and we'll be able to hear them, and hopefully this thing will end up sounding better than this DIY one does. So again, price points, $1,500 amp. This amp was about $1,200 in parts. It might be $1,300 today with inflation. So we're talking about an amp, even though it's a budget amp, paying retail for the parts is almost what this cost, and then you still have to build the amplifier. And then this one is probably $1,800. These output transformers were expensive, and these tubes aren't cheap, and just this is a really nice chassis. I mean, I think the chassis was $150, so definitely some more money into this one, but I just think this is super cool that these are almost 100-year-old tubes and it sounds as good as it does. So anyway, there's my subjective listening. I mean, I know everybody's going to have their opinion. People are asking me what mine is. That's my opinion. I still think this sounds better out of the box than this, and with the right kind of jazzy music, with the exception of some super bass heavy stuff, this may be the best sounding amp that I own, but it does need a preamp to drive it. When I was building this, I was thinking about adding another stage of amplification because these really old tubes don't have a lot of gain. Like, there was nothing like a 6SL7 back then, and these are like 1/2 of a 6SN7 feeding these pentodes. So it really needs a preamp to drive it to full power. So that is a negative on this amp, that it just really doesn't have enough gain to work well with just a modern source without a preamp. So anyway, that's where we are. Hopefully we're going to be able to do some mods to this thing, and between some tube rolling and the power supply, hopefully those two things will be all this amp needs to really take it to the next level where it sounds as good or better than this other 300B amp does. So I hope you're enjoying this content. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. That really helps a lot. Thanks again to you Patreon supporters, and also you folks that donate at my website. Also appreciate you guys that drop ship me gear and trust me with your equipment to showcase on the channel. So anyway, till next time, have a nice day.